Hello, welcome to episode 1 of a new audiobook podcast. And it's a science fiction book. It's one of mine, so I don't have any copyright problems reading the whole thing out to you. And it's called They Said There Was. Now, this is the first episode, so I don't know how many chapters I'll get through. I might get through 10 chapters. I'm not going to make things too long, though, so I'll cut it shorter if need be. I'll read you the blurb to see if it sounds like your kind of thing. Obviously, in a blurb on the back, you can't give too much away, but it gives you an idea of the book. So They Said There Was by Donna Emerald. It's a 2022 edition. If you want a hardback or a Kindle of it, there are links below. So, a pandemic. The mystery virus emerged from nowhere and swept around the world. They said it was lethal and would take a terrible toll unless the cure was found and steps were taken to control its spread. Robert was terrified at the prospect of being stopped in his tracks when he was a man on his way up the ladder, with success just in reach. Would they find the cure in time to save the world, or would Robert have to find other ways to survive before it destroyed him? So it's a story of survival, but it's a dystopian science fiction novel. So let's see how far we get today. And this is a podcast, so I've added it to a playlist. So when I upload other episodes, I'll do them all, do all the readings live, but you'll be able to catch them on that playlist. And I'll link to the playlist as well. Okay. There's Robert, in case you're wanting to get an idea what he might look like. So, chapter 1. It was all over the news. Suddenly, it just arrived and was the top story on all the news broadcasts. Robert always followed the headlines. You had to know what was going on in the world. And he always switched the evening news on at the 2 appointed hours, just before driving home from work, while waiting for Deirdre to put on the dinner, which he liked served sharp at 7 p.m, and mid-evening, when he tuned in again to see what new headlines there were, or updates on main stories from the first evening broadcast. So he was in the loop. The moment the story of the strange new illness scientists had discovered that appeared to be spreading at a rapid rate popped up on the news stories. It seemed to be some kind of virus, they'd concluded, after the top experts had analysed it under the microscopes or by whatever more newfangled ways they had of figuring out what these new things were. There was a picture of it, which was some kind of artist simulation of what it might look like. That little was known about it so far, but apparently it was a huge cause of concern to the scientists and health experts all over, since once you were infected with it, it could be lethal. Added to that was the fact that it was spreading at a phenomenal rate, due to all the passengers coming and going for business or holidays. The news person said it had been hitching a ride on many trips, probably, so had popped up suddenly in various places. Big efforts were being undertaken to find out what it was, as a top priority, so it could be stopped in its tracks. The news promised updates when more was known, so that was sure to be a story to follow. The rest of the news was the usual fare. Wars in places he wasn't sure he'd be able to identify on the map, that seemed to have cultural differences which made them seem very far away. A lot of the news didn't affect his daily life much, and he tended to take more of an interest in things closer to home, which might change his life. He liked keeping abreast of banking news, or how housing prices were doing, or how taxes on things he needed, like petrol for his car, were changing. The yearly national budgetary announcements were a sort of highlight of the year for him, news-wise, as there was a lead-up to the price changes announced. With wages not changing in an upward direction for, maybe some years now, he wanted to know in advance whether he was going to have to do his budget differently to account for the changes. He quite enjoyed doing this totting up, so it made up for the annoyance of prices rising regularly without wages rising. Deirdre wasn't this way inclined at all. She was more the arty type. Officially, she did move in the world of business, but you could hardly call being a teacher, looking after small children, a business-oriented job. And he was forever coming home to find her seated on the living room floor with bits of coloured cardboard and glittery constructions spread out around her, trying to build some little gewgaw that was supposed to get the children interested in learning. His skills with accounts were needed to keep the home budget balanced neatly, because she was one of those scatterbrain types that never thought of the future, while he knew you had to plan, even when you were comfortable enough and on the way up in the world, nearly at management level now. He sometimes had to step over her mess to get to his seat by the screen while she was in one of her fits of enthusiasm, lost in her own little world, and tell her to turn off her music as the news came on. At budget time, there was the odd panel discussion on politics programmes too to tune into, to get hints about where the budget increases for investment would be and where the losses would go. And you could start planning your own budget or thinking about the coming year and how you'd fare financially then. Otherwise, he didn't bother with the flickering screen much and usually went off to his document case to get his files he brought home from the human welfare office he worked at, while she switched to whatever she wanted to watch or switched the screen off for her music. She sometimes brought people to the house, her friends, so he was pleased then to have some paperwork to look at in the spare room, where there was a small desk, although strictly speaking you weren't supposed to bring files home. Everyone did it though, as the office could get very busy sometimes, and paperwork built up when it did. Robert was very good at getting through this. He had a slow and methodical approach, which meant he didn't make mistakes often, unless the over-manager returned the paperwork he'd completed, stamped and signed off on, to point out to the client. They referred to them officially as clients while at work, to keep a professional attitude to the great unwashed and unemployed, queuing up on the rows of benches facing the row of front booths, staffed by human resource operatives who dealt with them, had failed to complete their information properly, and the file was to be scrapped so a new one could be filled in again. Clients made a lot of mistakes like this, but he prided himself on never filing sloppy work, and often duplicated files he'd completed at home in the evenings to cross every T and dot every I neatly, checking the file again the second time, smiling with satisfaction before throwing the first version in the metal bin under his desk. Deirdre knew not to disturb him when he was working, so often the small bin filled up and he would have to ask her to clean the room. She didn't always have the right priorities when it came to keeping up with household duties, but he put up with it, and put up with the friends she brought around for wine and noisy chatter, being glad that the walls in the house were of solid breeze block construction, since there was usually a lot of noise emanating from the living room. After a quiet start to those evenings, they left early, but there were often fragrant smells left behind when they departed from what he suspected were illicit substances, since most of the women she brought seemed to be hippies with feathers and fringed things hanging out of them, and he couldn't stand them. Sometimes they returned, having forgotten a fringed handbag or scarf or some such nonsense, and their slovenly, hedonistic cheerfulness manner with him at the door annoyed him further. Deirdre liked her groups and joined in every group she could find as far as he could see. There was a craft group where they knitted and made various things, a gardening group, and even the local choir, which several of the hippies also were in, he realised when they started singing in the living room on a couple of occasions and calling it practice to make it seem like that was more acceptable. Women seemed to need to talk much more than men, and he supposed her groups were mostly for this. They were like children, really, and better seen than heard, as some wise man had said somewhere. At least she could cook, and dinner was usually on time, unless she was trying out one of her friend's foreign concoctions, which sometimes didn't work and were inedible, necessitating starting from scratch when maybe a toasted tuna sandwich would be produced eventually before she'd wander off to the kitchen again to dispose of the failure. Failure was her domain, although the extra money she brought in from working with the kids was a help when keeping the home budgets balanced, and she could buy her own bits and bobs of arty materials for her endless projects and pay for her group outings and membership of various women's things out of that as well. They pooled all the bills, of course, what with sewing machines and those silly bohemian lamps she liked cluttering up tables and always on, sucking extra money out of their electricity budget. The car had to be filled up, mortgage paid, and all the other household bills, which he kept track of and updated between completing work files, so at least someone had the reins firmly controlled. He was glad they didn't have children themselves, as they are very expensive and as noisy or noisier than Deirdre. Not that money was an issue. A man on the way up the ladder was to have good discipline in money matters until a higher position entitles him to loosen the reins on himself a little and have more well-deserved treats earned by hard work and caution combined. They had treats now, since his job was guaranteed and secure, and the occasional holiday was appropriate for a family in their position. And these could be planned out too to make the best of them. He allowed Deirdre to suggest places to go, since he often couldn't think of anywhere himself. But once he'd agreed to one of the choices of destinations she suggested, and he knew where he wanted to go, he quite enjoyed planning the itinerary and booking the best flights for an optimal holiday, and looking up on the virtual web what sights he wanted to see. Deirdre, of course, had to be accommodated with art galleries, since she was keen on art, but many galleries had interesting audio guide head devices which talked you through the history of the art and put it in context, making it more bearable than he had expected the first time they did it. He liked buildings, and the older the better, since there were guidebooks that had details about historical battles that you could read about. If you were in a place where they didn't speak your language and you couldn't watch the news when you were at a loose end in the evenings. He didn't drink himself, so wasn't keen on watching Deirdre get drunker as a meal at some scruffy trattoria dragged on, and she got more enthusiastic about the irritating locals singing or bashing away at whatever traditional instruments they specialised in torturing diners with. It was not always possible to find menus in your language either at these places, so it was reminiscent of Deirdre's mystery meals when colourful messes arrived in front of you. He usually made sure to have some crackers and cheese in the hotel room just in case the food proved as mysterious and suspicious as one of Deirdre's failed experiments. It was good to have holidays, though, and the neighbours no doubt noticed with interest when the car was loaded up with the packed bags. And he'd gone through the last-minute list before driving to the airport to check Deirdre hadn't forgotten anything vital like toothbrushes. Clearly he was a man going places. He always arrived home feeling fresh after a holiday and looked forward to getting back to the office and getting back in the swing of work. It provided conversation for break times, mentioning the sights he had seen. One must bond with fellow workers to be a cohesive team, although he usually confined himself to the small break room, since he'd given up smoking tobacco some time ago, realizing that the manager had a clear view of the spot outside the back of the building where the smokers took their breaks. And they were notorious smokers for sneaking breaks. He didn't want any of that kind of suspicion directed his way, that he might be skiving off on office hours and risk jeopardizing his imminent promotion. Chapter 2. Although they always took a few short breaks every year since they'd been married, it wasn't a good idea to be away from the office for too long if you wanted a promotion. He needed to show how indispensable he was to keep his feet firmly on the ladder for a manager's position. He was required, as a permanent worker these days, of course, to take the regulation amount of holidays, but he spread these out, handing in his holiday forms well in advance and ensuring that he took his breaks at the least busy periods, when the unemployed were not filling up the outer offices, as they tended to do just before public holidays were coming up, when their handouts were delayed or couldn't be cashed by banks that were closed for the holiday as well. Flights were cheaper at these times as well, so Deirdre needed to be reminded to make her suggestions early to get this organised. Deirdre had probably been the main organiser of their marriage as well, now that he thought of it, because although he drifted into her company a long time ago, by chance, they'd met at their co-educational establishment. She'd been the one who had asked for his help in a woodworking class. He'd always been a self-starter, as they phrased it on curriculum vitae and job applications the office filing cabinets were filled with. She shouldn't have chosen woodwork, in his opinion, in the first place, since she got stuck quickly and seemed to be always asking him to assist her with this joint or that tool to get a project done to the standards the young men in the class had no problems with and didn't need assistance with. She joined him in the lunch canteen a few times, then asked him to go for coffee, and they'd kept seeing each other even after their studies there were finished. She seemed pleasant enough and was acceptably attractive to him. When they kept going out and he'd got his job, after his clerical skills course, he proposed, as you do, and they moved into their first flat after getting married. Then, when he was made permanent, they got the house, since with her working as well, they could afford a mortgage. The government were very good at the time about giving mortgages to couples who worked. They were lucky because things were a bit stricter now, with new rules having come in, but the house was just a step up to better things, being a bit on the small side, just a cottage really. They didn't need extra space for children, as she discovered she wasn't able to have any a few years after they were married. She'd harangued him about it a bit, and it almost put him off doing his duty, thinking about wailing babies and the nappies and other expenses of it, not to mention the disruption to his routine. He was secretly pleased when she announced tearfully that she'd not had any success with her campaign to have a child. In fact, she used a plural term, so it seemed she had wanted to have more than one. If the neighbours were ever to ask, as they might, he thought, a few years on, he could always point out that she couldn't have any, and that would put an end to the topic. He didn't know the neighbours terribly well. You don't really get to when you're out at work all day and busy when you come home. He knew a few of them, though, to see, because he'd seen them regularly queuing outside the Human Welfare Office in the mornings on pulling his car around to the small car park. He liked to be on time, and in the few minutes before the office opened its doors, there was often a straggly queue forming, comprised of bedraggled-looking unemployed people. He usually remembered numbers better than names, despite having copied over many forms with their names on. But they all had the same miserable look about them. Why it was not preferable to have a stable job instead of lounging about looking for free handouts for the government was beyond him. But there were people like that in the world who contributed nothing but expected everything to be just given to them instead. As the news of the strange new disease that was spreading fast became more frequent and urgent a topic on the news, he liked catching up with the morning news on the radio in his car. As he sat in the heated car in the car park, those mornings he arrived early, usually Mondays, when there was a lot of filing to do and one couldn't anticipate how jammed the roads would be in the rush hour. It was better to leave the radio off on the journey, since even a momentary lapse of concentration can have fatal consequences on a busy road. But the news channels had stories on a loop, so you didn't miss anything, with updates added as any new developments and stories emerged. The stories of the illness were interesting. More interesting than the dowdy line of scroungers, hunched and wet in the morning rain at any rate. As he sorted out his paperwork once more, in the few minutes before entering the office, and made sure his hair was combed and shirt straightened, peering into the car mirror, leaning over to check his appearance so that he wouldn't have to waste time readjusting the rearview mirror before heading home again in the evening, he realized the new illness was quite a big deal. People were starting to die from it all over the globe, and still no solid answers had been found to figure out what it was and how it worked, to break the body's defense systems down entirely and produce a nasty death where you were struggling to breathe suddenly after no clue that you were even sick. He hoped it wouldn't spread to where he lived, as he couldn't afford to get sick and miss work, let alone end up in hospital, as the news said people were arriving in scores, having collapsed suddenly due to lack of oxygen, the illness having prevented them from breathing properly. He saw his overmanager unlock the side door, looked at his watch again, and took a deep breath, entering the office smiling slightly, which was always a good policy to follow for any man who wanted to show he was doing a good job and was suitable for imminent promotion. Chapter 3. They were calling it a pandemic now, officially on the evening news, and had stories about it spreading rapidly all over. He wasn't sure how worried he should be about it yet, though, as still not much was known, and the experts weren't even sure where its point of origin was to try to stop it from spreading so fast by eliminating it at its source. They had more clues about it now. It was spreading in the air, they thought, and highly transmissible, according to the experts. And it was spreading because all the travel everyone did, with unsuspecting carriers bringing it home and spreading it to people they knew without even realizing they had it. Scientists were helping the governments everywhere with tracking it, and it was being detected in places where people traveled most. It could have originated somewhere exotic, since they weren't sure yet from where it came. Maybe one of those foreign markets he'd seen on holiday with all sorts of chickens and strange birds you never saw before, for slaughtering in whatever unhygienic way these people's odd religions had going. They'd seen several things like that already. He'd taken minor precautions and told Deirdre to be careful about talking over the garden wall to the neighbours as they were coming and going, because they were potential sources of infection, which was the last thing they needed with a breadwinner in the house who couldn't afford to get sick. She was spending more time pottering about in the garden now, since it was nearing the end of spring. and her herbs and vegetable garden needed more attention. He'd wanted concrete out the front of the house because it made a lot more sense, with less to have to keep up. But she'd put up some resistance to the idea, and he'd let her put down her shrubs and roses, and she spent a good bit of time fiddling with them when she wasn't doing her plants out the back in the small garden she had there as well. It didn't make good economic sense to have a garden these days, with supermarkets stocked to the brim with all sorts of vegetables, cheaper than the cost of buying them yourself. What with all the fertilizers they need, an amount of work put in to get the damn things to grow. He didn't participate in her gardening activities except mowing the front lawn, and mostly left her to it, since it was her that wanted a garden, not him. But he'd had to stop off at gardening centres to help her lift heavy fertilizer bags into the car for it. So he knew the prices of these hobbies, and he'd worked out the costs, doing comparisons roughly on paper by examining the grocery bills she'd kept when she'd finished the weekly food shopping, so he could pay half at the end of the month. He could see prices were going up for that as well, which was only to be expected, since everything rose in price slowly anyway. He could make a good guess at how much the food bill would be, surprisingly high, considering there were only the two of them, and they usually ate the same kinds of meals every week. The meat was the biggest expense, since he didn't believe you needed too many vegetables in every meal to stay healthy, but you do need meat. Just a splash of colour on the plate was enough, vegetable-wise. With some meat to keep the man happy was the way to feed a healthy man. The herbs she grew were as unnecessary as the vegetables she sometimes misjudged and grew too many of, putting the excess in boxes to give her friends, and sometimes she bemoaned that the season was bad this year and little had flourished. The seasons seemed to be the same as far as he could see, every year, but he supposed she was just making conversation, as women like to do, and he'd usually nod in agreement to humour her when they were seated for dinner in the kitchen in the evenings. She'd sometimes make a conversational sally into different topics that she thought he might be keen on, like work, but his work was of a confidential nature since he was handling so many private files on clients, so that topic was usually shut down fast. He did sometimes fill her in on his promotional prospects, however, and how they were going, and as that was a neutral and non-confidential area, she understood that work was not to be gossiped about in any shape or form with her friends or their own neighbours. It had been made very clear to her that this might jeopardise his promotion. For example, he might mention some remark his manager had made about his work, like when he anticipated that they were in danger of running out of a JS 101 form, and might find that an anticipatory requisition for more before they ran to minimal stock levels when holiday periods might interrupt their arrival by several days would prevent havoc at the reception desks where forms were going to be in high demand when there was an anticipated fluctuation in the unemployment figures. The manager seemed rather impressed with his foresight and control over inventory, which was very important when you worked in a clerical capacity. People relied on him, and no doubt saw he was an indispensable asset to their department. He had just enough initiative without being too pushy about his skills. Co-workers don't tend to like that, he pointed out between mouthfuls of dinner. It makes them feel they have to compete to get the manager on their side. She tended to not be able to engage on this level, he noticed, and usually changed the subject she had herself introduced by asking if he liked the herb she added that was from her weed patch, as he privately named it, or bounced off into some other entirely unrelated strand of thought before trailing off, usually getting her vague look, staring out at the garden, at a bird on the feeder catching her attention, or nothing in particular. Women were not something you could figure out. And if the dinner was finished, you announced the usual phrase, "Well, I'd better do my homework," and laugh a bit at yourself to keep them happy, and retire to the other room to do your paperwork while they got on with their things to finish in the kitchen. It was duller at home than at work, but relaxing, and everyone needs to wind down in the evenings to tackle the new day ahead. Sometimes there were jobs at home, other than his work, particularly at the weekends. Jobs like washing his car, which was only every second week, although he always did Deirdre's car as well, the next week taking it in rotation. It was never a major job if you kept on top of it, as the roads to work weren't all that mucky, and they were lucky not to have parking spaces situated under a tree where falling leaves or bird droppings not only were a nuisance but could actually damage your paintwork as well. Sometimes a neighbour might comment on how well you kept the cars, and it was noticeable compared to other cars, he thought, that he ran such a tight ship in so spick and span a manner, with sails trimmed neatly, so to speak. There would be a bigger car to wash when he got promoted, but he didn't mind the upkeep and would probably go through the car washing machine at the fill-up station like the over-managers probably did when that happened. Then there were the more tiresome jobs, which weren't so often, like the 4 or 5 times a year the outside windows had to be cleaned, more if it was a particularly harsh year. The weather was going to get more unpredictable in years to come, he knew, since stories about climate change making sea levels drop and temperatures behave differently were always on the news. Weather wasn't something he would have had any interest in, except that for some reason he didn't understand completely. It explained why prices of things were going up, according to the news. Some of the tops of the windows required a step stool to be used, and there were always smears you'd missed that you had to go back out to do, just as you were settling down, thinking you were finished. Bringing the rubbish out to the bins was a lot quicker, so that was hardly a chore, just something you did automatically. He'd remind Deirdre when the other chores were approaching. That way you'd have the insides of the windows clean so you could judge whether you'd got the outsides right, making the whole thing more efficient. He left the inside of her car alone and only had a few wrappers of sweet snacks to remove from his, and a quick run around with a handheld dustbuster on the carpets after shaking them out on the pavement beside the car door to remove the main bits of pebbles and grit on them. Petrol levels would be checked, and there might be a trip to a station with the best price within a decent distance, if he was in the mood for a spin, since he was his own man at the weekend. These trips he enjoyed. He checked his phone first, as he had a handy app that told you the prices in all the stations he used. The prices were always going up and down a little, so you got the best deal if you checked around first. Then you filled up for the week, and it was a good trip that he felt a bit excited about, although sometimes there was a queue at the station, probably because other people had the same app. Still, you could sit in your car comfortably and watch other people as they sat in their cars, or went in and out of the petrol station to pay or to get coffee while they waited. His car was as nice as anyone else's and far shinier than most. There was set your standards low, even on the lower rungs of the ladder, if you wanted people to understand that you were going places. Chapter 4. The manager usually didn't join them in the small break room, and he was glad, since it would have made him nervous while standing at the coffee dispenser to try to produce the right tone of conversation. Did one talk about work at break times? Hardly, since the manager's work carried higher responsibilities, and with it more need to keep confidentiality about these. On many occasions, though, he'd engaged in brief, polite conversation on meeting other staff members taking their break, which were staggered on a roster to accommodate the flow of clients not being held up at the front desk for interviews and signature days, to prove they hadn't gone on holiday, but were actually at their listed residence, still applying for jobs. Conversation in the break room was characterised mostly by discussion of biscuits or the amount of clients waiting on the row of benches, or talk of holidays. This usually ceased entirely if a manager arrived to get coffee to bring back to his office. He once, perhaps rashly, proffered a plate of biscuits towards his over-manager as he was about to leave with one of his work smiles, but regretted it almost immediately as it didn't get acknowledged, and he had to sit red-faced with another co-worker for the whole 10-minute break before he could return to his own desk, as they were not allowed to have liquids other than correction fluid, which he prided himself on never using at their desks, with the risk of spills and damage to computers, which was state property that couldn't be replaced willy-nilly out of warranty, requiring all sorts of contractors having to be called up, and possible delays for other contracts in other official buildings. He was mindful of these things as someone in charge of requisitioning stationery forms and headed paper supplies himself. There was a supply chain with a flow to it that was more fascinating than people might realise. Certainly Deirdre couldn't see it, but obviously his manager could see the merit of having someone on board who was on top of these things, and he'd received compliments for the standard of his filing more than once. His manager literally smiled on him, and it was like the sun coming out when he instantly accessed a paper backup of the digital files on record for clients quickly, and managerial staff tended not to smile often publicly, since it gave the unemployed totally the wrong impression of what the Human Welfare Office was there for if they happened to see a smile. It was not optimal for co-workers to see the manager smiling at him either, since jealousy could well lead to blame being put on him for shoddy work, since sometimes files had to pass through several hands to be fully filled in and stamped officially after signing off by the main manager. A co-worker had once printed out a notice in a friendly-looking rounded font for the break room notice board, which he'd examined when they left the room, and he'd thought that awfully rash too. It said, "A smile is a virtual hug you give your co-worker. Make someone happy today." It was a bit over-personal in tone, he thought, for what was, after all, a serious job. And the yellow cartoon face smiling seemed right out of line with policy. But when he saw the email memo that upper management from the regional area had sent out earlier that day, saying staff morale was important to maintain and new policies were being put in place as part of an awareness campaign, he saw that it was entirely appropriate after all. He made sure to smile at co-workers more that week, although it wasn't clear how long the campaign would be active for. There were cameras in both the front and back offices, possibly in the two managers' offices as well, although he wasn't certain about this detail. So the manager might be checking whether you were actively engaging with the campaign and notice your participation, giving you another chance to shine. Of course, smiling all the time would be ridiculous and give totally the wrong impression while seated alone at your desk. He'd repressed his desire to smile more than once as work made him happy, particularly when he saw his inbox and outboxes balanced up. He felt in sync then, like he held the world in his hands with power at his disposal. Life was pretty good at work, ticking along nicely. But out in the world at large, the new illness was stalking the halls, looking for victims to kill, it seemed. The news was full of it now, and other stories that had been the main topics were relegated to brief mentions now that everyone wanted to hear about this strange disease. More was being discovered all the time, and it was horrifying how dangerous it was becoming. People were dropping dead suddenly in the street in one country, and it was being discussed daily by politicians working with top scientists what measures they could take for what was clear now was a major pandemic to slow down the death toll, where they found treatments to prevent death on the scale they feared. Even Deirdre was talking about it, and she seemed to pay little attention to news stories, rarely sitting by the big screen opposite the comfortable chairs lined up to face it, unless there was a movie or one of her follow-up women's things on, which she usually got a mug of tea ready for with some knitting out. "Do you think we should be worried?" she asked, looking at him as she sat down uncharacteristically one night after the news was nearly over, when the weather forecast person was pointing out the rain levels expected for the next few days and the rating for the storms, which had been sensibly colour-coded nationally as a recent development, using the red means stop, green means go system to designate the level of danger to property and person potentially involved. Yes, but it's nothing to panic about until we know more. Worrying doesn't achieve anything, Deirdre. I heard it's killing thousands daily. Do you think it'll come here? Probably. It spreads in the air, and we have so much international travel that probably people are bringing it in from wherever its point of origin is, he quoted, more or less remembering the way they'd put it many times on the news updates he tuned into whenever he switched the car radio on, which confirmed what was said on the evening news. This is why I already pointed out to you the importance of not sharing airspace too closely with neighbours. Then, spotting an opening for turning the topic to his pet hate, continuing, or inviting friends around the house. Goodness knows what they might bring in with them unsuspecting. He wouldn't hit her with this information he'd gleaned on what he'd found out about the new illness's makeup yet. Let that nugget sink in first. She looked thoughtful, staring out towards the garden in that abstract way she had, and the subject lapsed. She continued her little knitting things after dinner, and he retired to the spare room to finish some work. He liked to put on the old radio they used in the days they'd done a bit of camping when they were dating, and it still had batteries in it, so he left it on the news channel, finding it formed a pleasant background to what he was doing. And sometimes he found himself listening with interest now when brief updates were broadcast about the latest findings. There were some statistics coming in now too, which proved to be fairly interesting. He decided it would be a good idea to keep some track of these to find out what the government strategy would be as it developed. Things might get worse before they got better. That was sometimes the way, and the standard interview skills for Human Welfare Department Level 1 employees workbook he'd read through, bringing it home to pursue it at leisure, while updating his skills to include managerial level ones that would be needed when he got promoted, emphasised how the fluctuations in job markets didn't have to affect the client's frame of mind when seeking employment, and required adjustment of one's mindset to overcome their perception of hurdles, which were often opportunities in disguise to grow some skills like initiative, for example, starting one's own business. This offered clients the encouragement they needed to get outside their comfort zone and take up any available employment opportunities, which would also have the benefit of spent. It was a mutually beneficial approach to the problem of the unemployed, who commonly suffered from lack of self-esteem. In fact, he realised the new pandemic could be a good opportunity for him personally if it got worse. If any co-workers fell ill, or, God forbid, died from it, he would be even more indispensable in the office and would get promoted instantly. He needed to ensure he didn't catch it himself, of course, and air travel would be off the agenda for his family unit to ensure this. He had infrequent up-close contact with neighbours, but work could be a high-risk zone, especially after holiday breaks by other workers had been had. He must find out what their next holiday plans were, perhaps start introducing it himself more regularly as a topic at break time, casually, whenever he ran into them in the break room. The office environment itself wasn't the main issue, since the desks were wide and there was a few meters more between them for them to come and go to the filing cabinets or deliver something to the front desks. The break room was more risky, since more confined in space and more likelihood of someone lingering over you while you got your hot drink. This didn't usually occur, but it could, and something could easily be passed on with them breathing on you up close. He'd caught things before, transmitted through the air, when he had to take the bus frequently for work, when they'd been married first, after he'd gotten a foothold on his career. And of course, Deirdre was exposed to children all week, and they were known for spreading germs about. He always went to work, no matter how unwell he felt. But if he were to catch so much as a sniffle now, he might be suspected of having the illness. He was glad he didn't smoke anymore, since that made you cough sometimes, and that might be suspicious as well. The experts had distinguished some warning signs that you might have caught the illness, and coughs and sneezes, runny noses, and a temperature were all things to watch out for. You are supposed to see your doctor and not treat it as a minor symptom if you noticed all these symptoms together. You could be a super spreader of this thing if you had it, and then meet up with people. He thought of the ragged queue outside in the mornings and the constant coughs and wiping of noses they were always at when the manager opened the front door to them, and concluded that they might well prove to be the highest risk for the staff out front, although there were sturdy plastic screens on front of the long row of windows the staff talked to them at, so they couldn't breathe on them to infect them. He quite enjoyed weighing up the risk factors like this once he decided he wasn't at a high risk himself for getting it.